The Bible Treasury. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Article 11, Volume 13, 1880 and 1881. Part 2 of 2. 1880, 173. It is remarkable that the temple in heaven is only thrice mentioned in the revelation to John previous to the opening of the seventh seal, which is the commencement of sorrow to the earth. The three references are, Revelation 3 verse 12, Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out, and, Revelation 4 verse 9, under the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were beheaded, etc., and, Revelation 7 verse 15, in his temple shall dwell the innumerable multitude. This seems remarkable because during the sorrows and woes of the trumpets the temple holds so very prominent a place. Thus first, in Revelation 8, immediately after the opening of the seventh seal, an angel stands at the altar which was before the throne with a censer, and, when his work is done, the seven angels begin to sound. Secondly, Revelation 9, on the sixth angel sounding a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying, etc. Then thirdly, in Revelation 11, we have the temple of God, verse 1, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, etc. verse 19, again. Fourthly, Revelation 14, as to the harvest and vintage of the earth, we have three angels coming forth severally out of the temple, verse 15, out of the temple which is in heaven, verse 17, from the altar, verse 18. Fifthly, Revelation 15 to 5, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened, verse 6, another angel comes out of the temple with the plagues, and, verse 8, the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God, and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple, and, sixthly, from the same place, Ref 16, a great voice proclaims it is done. Verse 17. No one reading these contexts can doubt that one of the objects, in the prominent place given therein to the temple, is to identify the actions with the divine glory, and to show that they are more than the actions of God simply as Lord God Almighty upon the throne, though that throne is, in these passages, shown to be in the temple. They are the actions of God, as God, in the divine glory, and showing himself thus to be the object of worship, though still, through his emissaries, the overruler of all things likewise. Till the close of Revelation 7, the Lamb is upon the throne, and so far the throne, as the seat of the government of one whose glory was, through grace, then fully to be known, stands without mention of the temple, and he that is there is seen as the door of everything, but no sooner is the innumerable multitude from among all nations, etc., brought to be in the temple than the throne seems hidden in it, and the actions which follow are seen only in connection with the emissaries of the throne. And this is just as one would have supposed, for every member of the heavenly calling has full access to God, and they are the objects of the former portion. The 144,000 from Israel are the objects of divine regard during the latter parts, and their standing and privileges are different and lower, and God's dealings to the more intermediate, through angels, and the definite action not openly presented and distinctly described as to us, but set forth in figure and symbols and parables. On this account, I think that it is likely that while up to Revelation 12 all has been literal and no symbol used, henceforth, onward, till the partakers of the heavenly calling again become involved as the object of action, the description may run in symbol altogether. In approaching now to the consideration of the trumpets, I would notice one or two general principles connected with the study of truth. Our power of understanding Scripture consists in the mind and spirit of Christ, which we, as sons of God, have. The new creation in us has the mind of God, and to it, the Spirit, searching all things, yea, the deep things of God, communicates, as he will. Nevertheless, it is the written word wherein these deep things are found. This I believe to be of great importance, as showing the hindrance which knowledge, as men count it, gained by observation of present circumstances and experience, the study of history or works of man, may be, if not all tested by accordance with the written word. For instance, in approaching the subject of the seven trumpets, we come with heads full of notions about trumpets, derived partly from the modern everyday use of them, partly from the study of profane history, and it may be partly from books of the customs and manners of Oriental nations. Now just so far as these thoughts are different from the thoughts which would be formed in the mind of any simple child of God by the Spirit, in passing through his own mention of trumpets in the written word, just so far, I say, should we come to the subject with a false medium of communication. I would it were more our habit than it is, to trace out with patience and humility the Holy Ghost's use of words and things ere pronouncing what we believe to be the mind of the Lord on any point. To my own mind, in nature there is nothing more in a trumpet than the idea of a suitable means of drawing public attention in concourses of people. It might thus lead me in thought to warfare, or the field of battle, or the presence of an earthly monarch, but so habituated am I to the sound of it in mere daily life, that these things would be rather the results of thought upon the subject than first impressions, and certainly the highest to which thought in nature would lead me. Far otherwise are the thoughts awakened by the trumpet to the mind which comes fresh from the study of the Word. The first trumpet was divine, announcing the presence of divine majesty. To the holy priesthood the trumpet was given in Israel as an ordinance of the Lord, and none, either in the camp or the court, blew it but the priests. See note, for it was a call to God. The day of the blowing of trumpets ushered in that great feast of tabernacles, the type of better things yet to come, and when the blast was heard on the great day of atonement it was the immediate precursor of the Jubilee of Israel and the land. Joshua and Gideon also can tell us terrible yet glorious things of the trumpet, and who knows David, or Solomon, the then tabernacle, or the temple, and not the trumpets. Note. I observe throughout the Jewish scriptures, that in proportion as the people wandered from God all the ordinances through Moses became of no regard, and the trumpets, etc., common things, and no wonder if they neglected their God that they should neglect his ordinances. On the other hand, according to the measure of reformation, I find this, as the other appointments, attended to. End of note. Let us see this and so establish our general principle, once for all, by rapidly glancing at the scriptures which mention the trumpets. The first place in Scripture in which we meet with the trumpet, is in Exodus 19. It is here introduced to us as the herald of the presence of the divine majesty, when Jehovah formally displayed his glory to the people whom he had chosen to himself to be their king, upon the top of Mount Sinai, verse 13, when the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come to the mount. And, verse 16, there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And, verse 19, when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And, Exodus 20 verse 18, all the people saw the thunderings, and the lightnings, and the noise of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they removed, and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. Here evidently the trumpet was God's. Of the three great feasts annually kept by Israel, one only was ushered in with the blowing of trumpets, Leviticus 23 verses 1 and 2. In the 7th month, in the first of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, an holy convocation. This, called by some the Feast of Trumpets, was followed on the 10th day of the month by the Great Day of Atonement, verse 27, and on the 15th by the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 31. This first day of the 7th month is thus distinguished, Numbers 29 verse 1. It is a day of blowing of trumpets to you. But besides this day of blowing of trumpets, there was the trumpet of Jubilee, and this upon the Great Day of Atonement. After every 49 years, Leviticus 25 verse 9, then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, it shall be a jubilee unto you. A year of rest and joy was this to the land and to its inhabitants, when the alienation of property ended, and every man returned to his own possession. In Numbers 10 verses 2 to 10, we have the more general orders about the trumpets. There were to be 2 silver trumpets, of a whole piece, for the calling of the assembly and the journeying of the camps. When both were blown, the assembly was to meet Moses at the door of the congregation. When one only, then the princes, even the heads of the thousands of Israel. If one alarm was blown, the camps eastward were to set forward. if a second, then the camp southward. The sons of Aaron, the priests, were to blow. And it was promised that on war in the land, God would, on the alarm being sounded, remember and save them from their enemies. Also in the day of your gladness, and in your solemn days, and in the beginnings of your months, ye shall blow with the trumpets over your burnt offerings, and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, that they may not be to you a memorial before your God. And in chapter 31 verse 6 we find Moses sending Phinehas the son of Eleazar the priest to the war, with the holy instruments, and the trumpet to blow, in his hand. The new trumpets and the wonderful purpose the Lord put them to, connected with the capture of Jericho, may well claim our attention next. Joshua 6, when Jericho was straitly shut up by the children of Israel, the Lord said to Joshua, Compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about it once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of rams' horns, and the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. And so it was, but, as if to impress this upon our souls, we have not only this detailed order given, but the whole repeated over again by Joshua to the people, and the account of how they carried it into execution, given in full detail, and the success that followed, just as if the Spirit had found peculiar pleasure in resting the minds of those he would teach upon the ways of that God with whom we have to do. The next use of the trumpet we find by the judges through whom God delivered Israel from the enemies, whom their unbelief left to be lords in the land. Thus we have Judges 3 verse 27, after nobly slaying with his own hand Eglon king of Moab who had oppressed Israel 18 years, blowing a trumpet in Mount Ephraim, and then they went down and slew 10,000 Moabites, and subdued Moab that day. So again, Judges 6 verse 34, when Midian and Amalek came against Israel, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him. And the Lord chose 300 men out of the 32,000 who were gathered, and to these, he gave the victory. For Gideon divided them into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand, with empty pitchers, and lamps within the pitchers. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore for multitude. And Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp, and they blew the trumpets, and brake the pitchers. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, and held the lamps in their left hands, and the trumpets in their right bands to blow. And they cried, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon, and all the host ran, and cried, and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And there was victory. In 1 Samuel 13 verse 3 we have Saul blowing the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. The rest of the chapter would lead one to suppose that this also was in self-will. And we have Job blowing the trumpet, as in 2 Samuel 2 verse 28, and then all the people of Judah stood still, and pursued after Israel no more, neither fought they any more. Again, 2 Samuel 18 verse 16, and then the people returned from pursuing after Israel. And again, 2 Samuel 20 verse 22, and then they retired from the city, every man to his tent. In these 3 cases, as in that of Sheba, 2 Samuel 20 verse 1, when every man of Israel went back up after David and followed Sheba, it was the signal of retreat. Under David, too, we read much about trumpets, for he and all Israel played before the Lord with all their might on trumpets and other instruments, when bringing up the ark, both from Kirjath-jearim and from the house of Obed-edom. 2 Samuel 6 verse 15, 1 Chronicles 13 verse 8, 1 Chronicles 15 verse 28. And the priests also, in the movement from the house of Obed-edom, 1 Chronicles 15 verse 34, blew the trumpets, and, as we see, 1 Chronicles 16 verses 6 and 42, their use of the trumpet was in the arrangements of David for the ark fully recognized, as indeed yet more fully in the temple, as we see, 2 Chronicles 5 verses 12 and 13, 2 Chronicles 7 verse 6, 2 Chronicles 29 verses 26, 27 and 28, and in 2 Chronicles 13 verses 12 and 14, we have their place thus in the battle recognized. It was thus also that Solomon was proclaimed, 1 Kings 1 verse 39, for Zadok the priest took an horn of oil out of the tabernacle, and anointed Solomon. And they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, God, save King Solomon. Thus also, 2 Kings 9 verse 13, we have the officers recognizing Jehu as king, and 2 Kings 11 verse 14, and 2 Chronicles 23 verse 13, Joash proclaimed. And here, in the Reformation under Joash, we have a simple proof of the value set by God upon the silver trumpets as first appointed, in that they are included among the things which it is said Jehoiada did not make for lack of means. In the prophets generally, the trumpet is used simply as connected with war, as Jeremiah expresses it, Jeremiah 4 verse 18, Thou hast heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Yet there are a few passages calculated to leave a very strong impression upon the mind, as, Isaiah 27 verse 13, It shall come to pass in that day, that the Lord shall beat off from the channel of the river unto the stream of Egypt, and ye shall be gathered one by one, O ye children of Israel. And it shall come to pass in that day, that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. Again, Zechariah 9 verse 14, And the Lord God shall blow the trumpet, and shall go with whirlwinds of the south. We may refer also to Matthew 24 verse 31, He shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 52, At the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 16, The Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God. And be it remembered that when the Lord appears to John in Revelation 1, his voice was as a trumpet, verse 10, and the same voice as it were of a great trumpet called him up, Revelation 4 verse 1, to heaven. With these thoughts let us proceed. Revelation 8 verse 7, First angel. Hail is the symbol of wrath, Exodus 9 verses 18 to 33, Exodus 10 verses 5 to 15, Psalms 78 verse 47, Psalms 105 verse 32, Psalms 148 verse 8, Isaiah 28 verses 2 and 17, Haggai 2 verse 17, fire of discernment or judgment, blood of condemnation. Trees and grass are the more simple and natural means of life to man and beast, for the former see Genesis 1 verse 29, Genesis 2 verse 9, Deuteronomy 20 verse 19, for the latter, Genesis 1 verses 11 and 12, Deuteronomy 11 verse 15, Psalms 104 verse 14 and Psalms 106 verse 20. The presence of God having been announced by the trumpet, heaven-sent judgments follow. They are partly natural, as hail and fire, and partly above the course of nature, as blood. And they come, not on the unformed mass of nations, as the results of the next trumpet, but upon that which stands before God as the earth, the place in which his testimony has been, perhaps, and there they destroy all the more simple and natural ways and means of support. 1880, 190. The second trouble comes on the sea. The sea is the unformed mass of nations. Jeremiah 51 verse 42, Daniel 7 verse 3, a mountain is a kingdom in symbol. Isaiah 2, Daniel 2, a kingdom falls from the organized earth among the unformed nations under the judgment of God. Its incorporation marks off a third of the nations for destruction, and 1/3 of those not of the nations, yet living by them, are cut off, and 1/3 of the traffic by the nations ceases. For so would be the death of the fish, see note 1, and destruction of the ships. See note 2. Note 1. Ezekiel 29 verses 4 and 5, Habakkuk 1 verse 14, end of note 1. Note 2. Genesis 49 verse 13, 1 Kings 9 verse 26, 1 Kings 22 verse 48, 2 Chronicles 20 verse 37, 2 Chronicles 9 verse 21, Psalm 104 verse 26, end of note 2. The third trouble is upon the rivers and fountains. A great star, which is a leader or ruler, Numbers 24 verse 17, or teacher, Revelation 1, fell from heaven. That heaven is the symbol of that which has rule is clear from Genesis 1 verse 6, as gathered from its antitype, and from Genesis 37 verses 9 to 11, Joseph's dream. For the work of God in creation matter, as recorded in Genesis 1, is exactly in analogy the same as his work in the development of the work of redemption, the wonders of each successive day in creation being types of the wonders of each successive dispensation. The distinctive feature of the second day in creation was the firmament, as dividing the waters from the waters, and the distinctive feature of the second, or antediluvian dispensation, of which we read from Genesis 4 verse 1 to 8 verse 14, inclusive, was the introduction of rule among the children of men as connected with the heavens. As to Genesis 37 verses 9 to 11, we have the sun and moon and stars, Israel and the 12 patriarchs, as that for which and by which all order on the earth was regulated. See note. This great teacher then descends with full authority, as coming thence where the authority of rule is, and he has a great show of light, being, as it were a lamp that burneth. In Matthew 25 verses 3 and 4, we have the lamp as the symbol of profession. They took their lamps, etc. In Psalm 114 verse 105, we have, Thy word is a lamp to my feet, and a light to my paths, as showing the thing connected with God. The force of a lamp that burneth, as expressing bright light, is shown by Isaiah 62 verse 1, where it is said that Zion's salvation in the latter day shall be as a lamp that burneth, while the connection of the lamp with wickedness is shown by Proverbs 13 verse 9, the lamp of the wicked shall be put out. See also Proverbs 20 verse 20. Note. See also the type of the patriarchal dispensation, under which, too, this dream was, Genesis 1 verses 11 to 19, in the fourth day's creation, end of note. This great teacher, sustained with power and accredited by a great show of light, falls upon a third of the rivers and fountains. By a fountain, I understand doctrine. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. Proverbs 13 verse 14, the fear of Jehovah is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. Proverbs 14 verse 27, I might refer also, I think, to Zechariah 13 verse 1, the fountain opened to the house of David, etc., for sin and for uncleanness, as meaning doctrine of truth in power, and in the same way, to Revelation 21 verse 6, Revelation 7 verse 17. And by rivers, I understand the proceeds of these hidden springs and resources of doctrine or truth, whether in the concrete the waters themselves, or the channels through which they flow, or the teachings by which they were proclaimed. And thus Ezekiel 47 verse 5, and the parallel passages, as Joel 3 verse 18, Zechariah 14 verse 6, show the flowing forth on earth, as Revelation 22 verses 1 and 2, the flowing forth in heaven, of those fountains previously referred to, even the river of God. His name was Wormwood. In Deuteronomy 29 verses 19 and 20, he that hears the curses of the law, and says, I shall have peace, though I walk in the imagination of mine heart, to add drunkenness to thirst, is likened to a root that beareth gall and wormwood. See also the strange woman, Proverbs 5 verse 4. In Jeremiah 9 verse 15, wormwood seems the bitter results of disobedience, even being scattered among the heathen. See also Jeremiah 23 verse 15. Here, as in Amos 5 verse 7, ye who turn judgment to wormwood, seems to mean the corruption of the waters, resulting in the death of those that drank thereof. The fourth angel. On the symbolic meaning of the sun, and moon, and stars, I know not that I have anything to add to what was said under the last trumpet. If those remarks be correct, the result of this fourth trump will be obscuring judgment upon 1/3 of that which rules in that day on the earth, followed by an angel, or eagle, crying, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. See note, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the other angels which are yet to sound. Note. The earth. In prophetic diction, end of note. As the 4 first seals are marked off from the 3 last, so here we have a similar division of the trumpets into 4 and 3. In both cases, of the seals and trumpets, the 4 first are more general in character than the 3 last. Revelation 9. The 5th angel sounds. The object of this trumpet, as a whole, is evidently to bring torment for a limited time, and limited extent, upon all men, save the 144,000. The symbolic force of a star, and its fall from heaven to the earth, have been looked at. To him was given a key, the insignia of power, see note, to open the well of the abyss. That there is a difference between the well of the abyss and the abyss I do not say, though I think it well to notice, that while here it is free at abyssu, in verse 11, and in Revelation 11, Revelation 17 and Revelation 20, it is merely the abyss which is mentioned. I incline to think that there is a difference. The abyss opening into hell itself, the well of the abyss opening merely into the deep parts of the earth. Note. Isaiah 22 verse 22, Matthew 16 verse 19, Luke 11 verse 52, Revelation 1 verse 18, Revelation 3 verse 7, end of note. The pit was opened, and thence ascended a large and thick volume of smoke as from a furnace. I do not see definitely what the well of the abyss means, though the smoke ascending from it, as a thing from beneath, and from such a place, seems to impress the mind with the idea of the manifestation of an infernal origin. Smoke, as the accompaniment and consequence of fire or discernment in the widest application, would have a variety of meanings, though all of them having one leading common idea. The smoke of Edom going up forever, Isaiah 34 verse 10, would be the abiding proof of God's having acted thereunto upon his discernment of its state, etc. Isaiah 7 verse 4. The 2 tails of these smoking firebrands would express persons manifestly used as plagues. The smoke, Isaiah 4 verse 5, as of the cloud of smoke, was just the same as to the subject there, the manifestation of the presence of God. I cannot pass by the beautiful allusion here, Canticles 3 verse 6, the bridegroom being likened to a pillar of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense. In Revelation 8. For the smoke of the incense ascending up is the manifestation of God's approbation of the incense. In Revelation 15 verse 8 the temple is filled with smoke from the glory of God, and from his power, on the 7 vials full of the 7 last plagues being given forth. Here, in Revelation 9, I take that the smoke is just the expression of the place whence it comes, being under judgment, and of the darkening tendency of what shall proceed thence, as the parent or nurse of the locusts thence issuing, and the smoke is as, see note, the smoke of a great furnace, I suppose as expressing the fullness of its volume. The result was, that the sun and the air were darkened thereby. Note. This expression occurs also in Genesis 19 verses 28, Ezekiel 19 verse 18, end of note. The air is, I believe, the symbolic mode of expressing universal connection with the earth when looked at as not connected definitely with God. Ecclesiastes 10 verse 20, a bird of the air shall carry the voice. Matthew 8 verse 20, the birds of the air have nests, see also 13 verse 32, Mark 4 verse 32, Luke 9 verse 58, Ephesians 2 verse 2, the prince of the power of the air, just as the word heaven is used in connection with the word fowl, Jeremiah 7 verse 33, Jeremiah 16 verse 4, Jeremiah 19 verse 7, Jeremiah 34 verse 20, Jeremiah 15 verse 8, Ezekiel 29 verse 5, Ezekiel 31 verses 6 and 13, Ezekiel 32 verse 4, Ezekiel 38 verse 20, Daniel 2 verse 38, etc. I conceive also that the sun is thus used, not as where the moon and stars are also mentioned, but as expressing in like manner universality, as we find under the sun so constantly used in Ecclesiastes. What profit is there in any labor under the sun? There is no new thing under the sun, etc. And 2 Samuel 12 verse 12, I will do this before Israel and the sun. Out of the smoke, thus darkening the sun and the air, came forth locusts. Locusts were among the plagues of Egypt, Exodus 10 verses 4 to 19, and were known always as a plague. Deuteronomy 28 verse 38, Psalms 105 verse 34. In Proverbs 30 verse 27, The order of the locusts have no king, yet go they forth all of them by bands, is spoken of, and in Nahum 3 verses 15 and 17, the number make thyself many as the locusts. Thy crowned are as the locusts, and thy captains as grasshoppers, but these locusts are symbolic, for they are monsters most incongruous in their parts. The power they had of harming was not natural to them, it was given, power as the power of a scorpion. To harm the grass of the earth, the green things or trees, that is, to do the common works of their race, these locusts are prohibited and limited to tormenting men, not to kill them, but to torment 5 months, with the anguish of the scorpion sting. By this, I understand the infliction of some such things as the mark of the beast, something which, while it circumscribes man's liberty in a painful way, at the same time has a poisoning effect upon his soul. If the marauding nation spoken of in Joel I, and Joel 2, are the same as these locusts, they come up against the land, ranging over its precincts, under a satanic influence, for, God having then set to his hand to restore, Satan is seeking to hinder. It strikes me that in the days of our Lord, when the remnant, issuing in the church, which corresponded with this 144,000, which shall, in the time we are now reading of, be delivered from the power of these plagues, that the remnant, I say, was delivered by its allegiance to the Lord from some such thing. If any man confessed Jesus to be Christ, he was to be, ipso facto, hyposynagoguos. Again, such edicts as we read of in Daniel 3 and Daniel 6 by Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, both of whom were of the stock which, in the day of these trials, shall be blossoming in wickedness, may also be considered. If the scene of these scorpion stings be the land and its precincts, and any such thing be that referred to, we can see and understand it, for a Jew of very moderate attainment in Judaism would feel anguish and vexation of soul enough to make him hate life and choose strangling rather, though he might not refuse to submit. See note. Many a thing in England the Hebrew nation has to submit to as the result of collision between its peculiar polity and the lenient laws of England. They are obliged, for instance, by a special covenant before marriage, to do away with their ability of acting upon part of their law. And we know how time was when in Spain edicts were passed with the view of forcing the Jews to leave the country spontaneously or to compromise their consciences. Note. See, for instance, Pharaoh's edicts in Exodus, end of note. The object of the description of their appearance seems to be to mark their monstrous character and characteristics, yet this was universal, that, wherever they came, the result was the tail and sting. The description runs thus. First. In shape, they were like unto horses prepared for battle. Horses were prohibited to Israel, Deuteronomy 17 verse 16, and they were brought from Egypt. 1 Kings 10 verse 28, Pharaoh is compared to a horse rider. Exodus 15 verse 21, Isaiah 2 verse 7, Zechariah 9 verse 10. The Assyrian hosts were famous for horses. 1 Kings 20 verses 20 and 25, 2 Kings 18 verse 23. Thus they represent strength, Job 39 verse 19, Psalms 147 verse 10, swiftness, Jeremiah 4 verse 13, Habakkuk 1 verse 8, fearlessness, Job 39 verse 18, Jeremiah 8 verse 6, majesty, Esther 6 verse 8, and strength in the battle. Proverbs 21 verse 31, Jeremiah 6 verse 23, Jeremiah 8 verse 16, Jeremiah 12 verse 5, etc. Second. On their heads, crowns of gold, expressing manifest and conscious dominion, for the crown is the symbol of royalty, priesthood, and victory, passum. Third. They had faces like men's faces. From the use of the face, 34 verse 29, Exodus 33 verse 11, Ezekiel 10 verse 14, Ezekiel 41 verse 19, Revelation 4 verse 6, I understand this as intelligence, and from its connection with man, who, as contrasted with woman in the next clause, personates lordship, they have manifest intelligent lordship. Fourth. They had hair like the hair of women, length of hair, being perhaps the badge of luxuriousness, or beauty, 2 Samuel 14 verse 26, Isaiah 3 verses 2. The reference to women definitely may be the assertion of the appearance of weakness, Isaiah 3 verse 12, Isaiah 19 verse 16, or 1 Corinthians 11 the hair as for a veil, apparent subjection. 1881, 240. Fifth. Their teeth were as the teeth of lions. This shows their preparedness for consuming, for the lion, whether applied to Judah, Messiah, Satan, or in nature, stands for courage and power. Proverbs 28 verse 1, Proverbs 30 verses 14 and 30, Daniel 7 verses 7 and 19, Joel 1 verse 6. Sixth. They had breastplates as it were breastplates of iron, unassailable defensive armor. Ephesians 6 verse 14, 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 8. Seventh. The sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots. See Isaiah 37 verse 24, Jeremiah 47 verse 3, Jeremiah 46 verse 15, Ezekiel 26 verse 10, Joel 2 verse 5. They did not attack the grass of the earth, neither the green things, etc. For the force of this, see trumpet first. Though competent, and though apparently made to conquer the earth, this was not their object. Perhaps the double name in Hebrew and Greek shows that their power will be upon Jews and Gentiles. An edict, instituting and enforcing a fine upon the observance of circumcision, or of the unity of God, see note, by any power ranging over the precincts of the land, would produce just the recklessness referred to. The nursery of these marauders, if not their nest, was a thick mist of mysticism and error from beneath. Note. Or any such dilemma, I think, as would throw a man who had naturally Jewish propensities, between the 144,000 and heathenism, with the necessity of choosing one or other. End of note. The star, by whose means the way is made for them, does not seem to be marked as their leader. He, the star, is perhaps only the remover of the hindrances which prevent the smoke rising. The mists from beneath, in themselves savouring of judgment, as smoke tells of fire, do away with the light and air, destroying apparently that in which man finds his way before God, and that also which is the power of mutual association. Thereupon result these marauders, already looked at. They seemed fit but for one thing, to eat grass, etc. But, in fact, this they did not, but only used the power, not natural to them but bestowed upon them, of torment and torture. Hitherto the sad results of each successive blast have been worse than those of that which preceded, and more manifestly laying bare, and declaring the presence of, the hand of God, and so in the coming trumpet. On the sounding of the first, hail and fire, mingled with blood, were cast on the earth, to the destruction of 1/3 of its produce. The second brought a great mountain on fire into the sea, for a similar destruction of 1/3 of its contents. The third issued in the poisoning of 1/3 of the rivers and fountains, so that many men died. The fourth brought darkness on 1/3 of the sun, and moon, and stars. The fifth was a scourge and trial of all not having the seal of God, thus making manifest God's object of affection and desire, and so confessing him more plainly than ever, even as the gradual development of power, in that part of the series which had preceded, had gradually made the divine power, which was at the bottom of it all, more and more conspicuous, for the actions become more and more manifestly divine as to the extent of power. In the fifth, the sealed have been exempted from the trial, so far at least as the scorpion stings were concerned. Whether beyond this I know not. On the sixth angel sounding, the cry comes from the golden altar, as showing where the mind which regulated, and which was the spring of it all, was, and perhaps also showing that that altar, which had been the altar of the heavenly calling, was in some sense, in its past history, connected with it all. The scene of this wave of trouble is wider than of the preceding, for its waters were circumscribed to the bounds of the Hebrew and Greek tongues. Here the trouble springs up in the Euphrates and has a fourfold energy, going whithersoever there is idolatry. There is a haste and a wildness in the mighty rush here presented to us, and an all-devouring character of action prominently displayed in their first appearance, very unlike the character of action in the last trumpet. There is no presenting of any such idea of order, preparedness, dominion, intelligent lordship, or apparent gentleness, as in trumpet fifth, but the 200 millions are presented at once, brilliant as the flames in action, and consumption, rather than victory, marking their progress, while behind them is felt the stinging wretchedness of subjection to them. The sorrow rolls in judgment over hedonism, but leaves it, in moral result, just where it was. If these horsemen are the Lord's, this visitation may be, perhaps, a plague, or pestilence, and the four angels be the same who, in Revelation 7 verse 1, are represented as having it in them to withhold the wind, and so injure the earth, etc., and so symbol is preserved throughout, which I judge to be the case. I know not whether the whole four angels were for a year, a month, a day, an hour, or whether one for a year, another for a month, another for a day. If so, as all four were loosed at once, the sorrow decreases, etc. Ere proceeding, we must remark, how immediately between the close of the results of the fifth trumpet, and the sound of the sixth, the announcement, verse 12, one woe is past, and, behold, there come two woes more hereafter, comes in, referring to a somewhat similar verse, Revelation 8 verse 13, introduced between the results of the fourth trumpet, and the sounding of the fifth. A verse, similar to the 12th verse of the 9th chapter, is found, Revelation 11 verse 14, the second woe is past, and, behold, the third woe cometh quickly, which refers, I conceive, to the results of this sixth trumpet, and marks Revelation 10 and Revelation 11 verses 1 to 13 as a parenthesis. The object of this parenthesis I conceive to be just to show the state, morally and as to circumstances, of the inheritance, toward the assuming of which, by the Lord, all this action is moving on, at the time of the end. It seems to me also to be presented more as a piece of prophetic history, and the burden of the parenthesis is the vision of the state of things, as characteristic of the place at that time, and not of those actions of the Lord, like the parts we have been considering, which have, as their end and object, the introduction of his lordship only. Revelation 10. The object of the descent of this mighty angel, and his conduct as to the little book seem to me two distinct things. Confessedly he is the archangel and comes to claim the earth and sea as his own, as was promised in Psalm 8. The connection of a cloud with the Lord is common. In the following places, it was the covering of the Lord, Ezekiel 16 verse 10, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud, Ezekiel 19 verse 9. Ezekiel 24 verses 15 and 16, Ezekiel 34 verse 5, Leviticus 16 verse 8, I will appear in the cloud, on the mercy seat. See also Numbers 12 verse 5, Deuteronomy 31 verse 15, Daniel 7 verse 13. The connection of the returning Lord with clouds is too frequent to need notice. This, and the rainbow about his head, that is, his crown, the insignia, as seen in Revelation 4, of the covenant with creation, and his face like the Son of Man's, Revelation 1 verse 16, as the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire, as in Revelation 1 verse 15, all tell his dignity. Well, he conies forth in all this dignity, with a little book open in his hand. But the book does not seem the important thing, for he sets his right foot on the sea, and left on the earth, thus claiming them for his own, and shouts aloud. Perhaps, in 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 16, with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the trump of God, refers to the shout here given, to the swearing which follows, and to the seventh trump, I say perhaps. Upon this shout, as of a lion, seven thunders utter their voices. In themselves, I conceive they are the divine sanction, or response, to the action and cry of this lion, as in Ezekiel 9 verse 23, 1 Samuel 12 verse 17. In the substance of them, in that they could not be revealed, but were sealed up, they may have contained some expressions of God's mind in connection with that which the little book opens, which, as connected rather with God's estimate of the principle at work in the scene it would open, were not properly expressed at a time when all divine action was confined to the bringing in of the Lordship, and not to witnessing against evil. I know nothing which gives the soul more freedom in reading the book than this sealing up, as telling of the care and love and foresight which has closed in the book all that we might not see. It strikes me that the voices having been heard by John, and the writing of them forbidden to him, the revelation of them to him was probably somehow connected with his peculiar service of testimony. But, oh, how sweet it is to rest in the love that sealed them to us, and opened them to John, and to be able to be without jealousy or grudging against him who has made the difference, or against John to whom it was made. On the command, "Seal up," and by a voice from heaven, the mighty angel lifts up his hand to heaven, and swears by him, by the everlasting Creator, thus letting out who himself the while was, that there should be no more delay, but, on the seventh angel sounding, the close of the mystery, C-note, of God, according to the testimony to the prophets, should take place, then the voice that had commanded the sealing of the thunder's voices sends John to take the little book. The mighty angel tells him it shall be sweet in taste, but bitter in digestion. John takes it, and finds this true, and the mighty angel says to him, "Thou must prophesy again before many peoples, and nations, and tongues, and kings." 1881, 255. There seems to me a correspondence between the bitterness in John's belly and the voices of the thunders, on God's part, judgment, on John's, as the representative of the servants of God, bitter sorrow. The introduction of this mighty angel also seems to me connected with the change in the character of the prophecy. Hitherto all the testimony had been about what God alone should do, and that as bringing in the Lordship, not a testimony to man, but a special prerogative revelation by the Son to his servants. Now, however, it seemed good to state what at that time would be a matter of testimony to all nations, tongues, etc., for they all shall have part in the scene, and the testimony is not as to God's actions in bringing Lordship, but God's forbearance to man, when he, led by Satan, will be setting up other gods, and therefore John is chosen. For though the Lamb will be and is the channel of communication, now and ever, from the Father, and from God to the sons and servants, not he but they stand before the world, and this, to me, is just the opening of the necessity for this change. As the temple hitherto has been the temple in heaven, Revelation 11, such, I suppose, is here likewise, the more so, as the outer court is defined to be the holy city, that is, Jerusalem, and it cannot be both temple and court. Moreover, in verse 19, Jerusalem having been spoken of, and so the danger of mistake brought in, the temple in heaven is specified. What is meant by the order, rise and measure, etc., I know not, unless it be the expression of God's desire, and the way taken, to call the servant's mind, at this juncture, off especially, and definitely to fix it upon the blessed truths the servant knew from chapter 7. Would, at the time this was acted out, be his own portion in the sanctuary itself. This would be refreshment from the bitterness of belly just felt, and about to be felt yet more in the scene which followed, the marking to the character of his sorrow, and most high position, to be able to have such, not sorrow for himself, but, from association with the Lord's name, and honor, and spirit. And such, both in Ezekiel, Revelation 11 onwards, and in chapters 21 and 22 of Revelation, seems to be the object of the specification of measure, and how blessed in that hour will be the worship in the temple, though so sadly contrasted with the holy city or outer court. And thus, for the first time in the book, I think, Jerusalem on earth comes before us, estranged indeed from God's ways, and trodden down by the Gentiles, and that most actively for 42 months, notwithstanding its being part of the earth claimed by the mighty angel as his possession. It is this claim, with the especial bearings of it on Jerusalem, which brings in the witnesses. And sadly is their lot, though most honorable in itself, contrasted with the lot and portion of the worshippers within the temple. Amid the treading down of the city, they witness in sackcloth for God till, their testimony being ended, the beast makes war upon them, and overcomes and kills them, to the joy of all the Gentiles, people, nations, kindreds, and tongues, treading down the city, and to the vindictive delight of their own countrymen, those who are natives of the land. Who they are I know not unless the 144,000 sealed in chapter 7. The expression, the beast makes war against them, and overcomes them, and kills them, see note 1, and their bodies being seen by the nations, peoples, tongues, etc., in the broad way of the city, rather inclines me to think that they are not only two individuals, see note 2, but a large body of persons. Their power is of God, verse 3, and by him they are placed as his witnesses, fed by and giving light before him, as now claiming to be God of all the earth. Verse 5 looks to me also, in addition to verses 7 and 8, as symbolic, fire proceeding out of their mouth, and devouring their adversaries, see note 3, though verse 6 is not so. If Elijah and the 144,000 constitute God's testimony, part may refer to the one, and part to the other. It may be also that there will be some such double action in Elijah as in Moses, in that he first goes to the people, and then makes the display of his power before Pharaoh. The work of Elijah, in the closing up of this dispensation, may be the means and instrument of gathering out the 140,000. But whoever they are, their actions have a double character. I speak not of their testimony, but actions, as in verses 5 and 6, partly like Moses, using power over the world, to the annoyance of one of its lords, partly like Elias, closing the heavens from an apostate people, etc. Just what will be needful for a testimony in Jerusalem, when the people, far from God, are lending themselves to some infidel heads of the nations around them. Note 1. One could hardly say this of Herod's cruelty to James and Peter, end of note 1. Note 2. The thought of Haman's heart, in Esther, comes more before us than the slain one on Calvary, end of note 2. Note 3. See Revelation 9 verses 17 and 18, end of note 3. I would remark, that all the action, in Revelation 8, Revelation 9, is of God, toward the bringing in of the Lordship into earth. Revelation 10 is the link from above, and Revelation 11 the link into it from beneath. Revelation 12, onward, the state of things on earth. Revelation 10 is thus the revelation of the connection of God's actions, seen by the saints, but not by the world, with the first manifestation of that purpose to the world. It seems to me that who the witnesses are, is a question proper to the Christian while reading this, apart from the object of their mention. It may be, and doubtless is so. Here the simple point was, there would be an adequate witness supplied of God, and upheld by him, till his purpose, and ours too, as fellow laborers with him, is accomplished. The Old Testament does supply one witness for that day, Elias, the New another, the 144,000, so far is truth if such be the meaning here. The candlestick, in Zechariah 4, with its 7 lamps, seems to me the light of God's grace, establishing by righteousness, by his power in providential sway, a testimony. The question there is as to the return from Babylon. Salvation of Jah was high priest when established by grace therein, a stone, see note 1, with 7 eyes in it, is laid before him and his fellows, as a pledge of the bringing forth of the branch. Then this candlestick is shown to the disperser of Babel, the governor, and this word said, verse 6, not by power, nor by might, but by my spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. What is this, but that the great mountain should become a plain before Zerubbabel, that is, Babel utterly wane, and the headstone of the temple, verse 8, be brought forth, with shootings, grace unto it. See note 2. The hands of Zerubbabel, who laid the foundation, shall finish it. Thus was Zerubbabel, as the representative of kingly power, establishing the temple for a great light, though it was not by power, nor by might, but by my spirit, saith the Lord, for the stone, Daniel 2, should come in with the full impress upon it of the 7 eyes of the Lord, which run to and fro through the earth. Note 1. Haggai makes himself and Zerubbabel the leading parties. Zechariah makes Joshua, end of note 1. Note 2. See also Haggai, end of note 2. The 2 olive trees here, feeding this light, and standing before God, are Haggai the prophet, and Joshua the high priest, yet as representatives of the prophetic and priestly office especially, so, at least, I take it. See Haggai Passim. In Revelation, both the witnesses are candlesticks and olive trees. Their testimony is evidently double, first, to those that dwell on the earth, secondly, to the nations. This may account for the being 2, and it is plain to me that the representative of kingly power here is not on the side of God, but against. These 2 both give light and are anointed ones by God. The nations preventing their bodies being put in graves, verse 9, carries the mind to Psalm 79. After 3.5 days they are revived from death and called up to heaven before all men. A great earthquake follows, and 1/10 of the city falls, and 7,000 names of men are slain. The rest are affrighted and give glory to the God of heaven. See note. Note. Has this anything to do with the 2 late virgins? End of note. The second woe is announced to be past, and the third at hand, and then the seventh trump sounds, and heaven proclaims that the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ, and he is to reign forever and ever. The 24 elders worship God, perhaps as showing the thing was still not a matter of manifested display even yet, or, if so, not yet to be looked upon by the reader as such, and praise God for having taken his great power, and reigned, and, spite of the anger of the nations, brought in the time of just retribution and reward to all, whether they have done evil or good. It does not seem that the recognition of the kingdoms of this world having become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ is made, as recorded in this chapter, anywhere save in heaven. This may be of moment to notice,